Hello, everyone. People are just joining us now. The very warmest welcome to Querying Psychotherapy. My name is Uli, and I am a bookseller at Gaze the Word bookshop. And you are also warmly welcome to this evening's event with Chance Czyzselska, Ellis J. Johnson, and Robert Downs. It's a joy to have you with us this evening. And for those of you who booked very early on, thank you for sticking with us as we pivoted the different forms this event might take. We really appreciate you sticking with us. In Querying Psychotherapy, editor and psychotherapist Chance Czyzselska speaks with a range of diverse LGBTIQ+ therapists and educators whose lived experience inform their way of working with their clients. LGBTIQ people are more likely than cisgender and heterosexual people to suffer with mental health issues, yet often have poorer therapeutic outcomes. Mainstream Eurocentric psychotherapeutic theories, developed largely by heterosexual, cisgender, and white theorists, tend to see queer individuals as a singular group through this othered lens. Despite the undeniable value offered by many of these theories, they and those who use them, queer therapists included, can often pathologise, marginalise, misunderstand, and diminish the flourishing diversity of British queer and trans lives. And that's what this book seeks to attend to and to redress. At the end of their introduction in this fantastic, extraordinary, diverse book of 15 different therapeutic perspectives and insights, Chance describes clients seeking to discover a lightness in their way of being. And I think it could be useful to just kind of sit on that idea for a moment. As someone who has engaged with psychotherapy throughout the course of my life, I just want to take a moment to thank therapists, thank people training to be therapists, and thank retired therapists, because the work you do, you're like physiotherapists for the psyche and the soul. You have and continue to change, improve, and enrich lives. And a book like this that can unfetter that process and make it more queer and kind of racially inclusive will just make us stronger and more vibrant in living our lives. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the power of the work you do and to say thank you. So I'm briefly going to more formally but briefly introduce the speakers tonight. Chance Czyzselska is a relational integrative therapist and counselor in private practice. They are also a journalist and a writer. Ellis J. Johnson is a psychodynamic psychotherapeutic counselor, trainer, and supervisor. And Robert Downs is a psychotherapist, supervisor, teacher/facilitator/student of disruptive practice and thought. There will be plenty of opportunities to pose questions later on in the event. Please drop those in the comments box, and the speakers will find their way to them and answer them in due course. But without further ado, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Chance Czyzselska.
Hey, thanks, Uli. Thank you so much. That was a lovely introduction. And I wanted to say thank you for hosting this book launch. I mean, I know we're meeting digitally, but it feels very special to be virtually held by the bookshop that's held our community between its walls for so many decades. You know, this is a particularly important, experience for me. And I'm sure my co-contributors as well. I wanted to thank Ellis and Robert as well, my brilliant co-contributors and co-conspirators who continue to teach and inspire me. And I want to thank you all for attending. There's been such a hunger for this book. And I'm really just so delighted to be able to be here sharing in the birthing of this book with you. So I'm Chance Czyzselska, they, them pronouns. I'll just give a quick visual description of myself. My look is a cross between vintage David Hockney and Bart Simpson. I'm white, I'm in my early 50s. I have thick round black glasses and hair like Depeche Mode's Martin Gore. I'm wearing a white t-shirt and I'm sitting in my study in front of two wonderful landscape paintings. So I'd like to start by giving some context to the why of querying psychotherapy. So So for LGBTIQ plus POC and other marginalised folks, much of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis are broken. That may sound provocative, but in the UK, psychoanalytic organisations only apologised for labelling homosexuality as an illness around 10 years ago. And in the US, it was just a few years ago in 2019. And also, all of our global systems are broken. So why wouldn't some of the theories that come out of them be too? So I'll give you an example. In a paper that was written in 1979 by the psychoanalyst Limentani, who at the time was the president of the British Psychoanalytical Society, he wrote that homosexuality should be understood as a defensive solution to a variety of neurotic and psychotic problems. So, of course, there've been, and there still are, feminist, lesbian, gay, and queer practitioners, some of whom have critiqued these so-called theories, and some of them I reference in the book and other people reference in the book, but you can get a sense of the legacy of harm within our profession. So, yeah, psychotherapy and psychoanalysis are broken because they tend to locate the problem in the individual or their family, and they rarely acknowledge or understand how factors like sexuality, gender, race, and class, ability impact on clients' lived experiences. I can't tell you how many times I've heard clients say they've been misgendered or shamed about their sexuality, or when they talk about racism with a white therapist, when they've been pathologized or problematized and othered by therapists. And as LGBTIQA plus folks, our differences are often considered to be the source of our problems, and not the fact that we live in a world that devalues and denigrates certain embodiments while rewarding and expecting everyone to be white, cis, and heterosexual. This book is an antidote to that. This book was co-created to make visible the structural inequalities that impact clients who are queer and trans and POC, or any clients who have identities or aspects that fall outside of what's normatively expected, or of what Jake Yearsley, who's in the book too, calls the heteronormative trance. So let's just think for a minute about the word identity. The Spanish trans philosopher Paul B. Preciado says, psychoanalysts have always believed that only the queers, the Jews, the lesbians, the migrants, the trans folk, and the Blacks have an identity. And in a speech he gave recently to an audience of about 3,500 psychoanalysts in Paris, analysts who incidentally tried to humiliate and shout him off the stage, he asked, do you believe that you, the normal, the hegemonic, the bourgeois white psychoanalysts, the binary, the patriarchal colonials, have no identity? There is no identity more rigid and sclerotic than your invisible identity, than your Republican universality. Your weightless, anonymous identity is the privilege of sexual, racial, and gender norms. So this is a context that we and our clients find ourselves in a mental health crisis, particularly so amongst trans and POC clients who are bombarded with hate day in, day out on the streets, on social media. And it's sure to get worse, you know, in this kind of post-Brexit, COVID, economic, political, climate, everything crisis that we're in. So whether you're a therapist or in therapy or just interested in therapy, Queering Psychotherapy is an accessible and radical collection of conversations and learnings from a range of voices talking and thinking together about therapy and the normativities around gender, sexuality, and race, and examining and critiquing the neoliberal ideas of personhood that elevate certain bodies and denigrate others, and that dictate who gets, as Gail Lewis, who's in the book, says, to live a livable life and who doesn't. And Queering Psychotherapy is not a how-to book. All the contributors in the book have a range of lived experiences and various kinds of proximities to psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. I reject the term expert as a patriarchal and hierarchical term. What you'll find if you do read it is, as Robert Downes says, a multiplicity, a generative, generous, healing, joyous, radical, angry range of suggestions and ideas and practices. And it's also really important to remember that thinking and living from and in the margins gives us tools to live life differently. Queer and trans and Black and brown feminist thinking, ways of being in and dismantling of harmful structures within and outside of us is a struggle, but it's also a balm, it's a joy and a liberation. And as Ellis says, cisnormativity ignores the complexity, wonder, and brilliance of human experience. To be honest, I wish I'd had a book like this when I was training. And I guess that's part of why I wanted to put something like this out into the world. In making the book, it's been a second training in itself. You know, speaking with all the contributors, I learnt loads from absolutely everyone, particularly from Robert and Ellis. And as a client, I know that I would have been more informed and empowered at times when I felt most vulnerable. But before I read an extract from my introduction, I wanted to ask Ellis and Robert why each of you wanted to be involved in the book. What was it about the project that kind of spoke to you?
Robert, do you want to go first? Oh, you're on mute.
Go ahead, Ellis.
Okay. Yeah, firstly, good evening, everybody. It's really, really lovely to be here. I'm so glad to be asked to come and talk more about this book. I love this book so much. I'm so excited to be asked to be part of it. And thank you, Uli, for all the running around and trying to get everything sorted online or in person. I'm glad that we came together eventually. So, you know, for me, I think what was radical about this book and why I'm so excited about it is that trans people don't often get to speak for themselves. I think at this point in time, lots of people think they know about trans folks. Lots of people think they know about the trans experience. You know, you pick up any newspaper and there'll be, you know, in the case of the Daily Mail, for example, there'll be 3 or 4 stories a day telling you about transness and trans experience and gender and medicalization and all those kind of things. I think it's really, well, incredibly vital at this point in time that trans people get to speak for ourselves, speak in our own words, not just about trauma and dysphoria and the hardships of being trans, of which we know there are many at this point in time, but also about the, you know, the brilliance, the thinking of the trans community, the experiences, the you know, the joys and the motivations, how fun it can be to be trans. I find it brilliant. I love being trans, being a trans man. So I think for me, I was just very excited to bring a voice to the table that was mine, that was trans through. So thank you. Yeah, thank you, Chance, for inviting me to be part of it. And yeah, for you, Robert, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I can't remember the origin story anymore, whether you asked me to write about shame or you asked me to write and I said I would, and I chose the topic. I don't remember. You might, Chance.
I think I asked you to write about shame because
Okay.
I've been on one of your shame workshops and found it so brilliant. And then we sort of had a conversation and then we wrote some stuff. I transcribed it. We had a conversation. I transcribed it. And then you improved it, basically.
Well, it carried on the improvisation. So yeah, yes. So the chapter came out. Well, it came out of a workshop about shame, but it comes out of my life story of shame. It's not just a clinician's kind of account. It's a person, a gay man who is also a clinician, and it's really important for me to write, bearing in mind our collective humanity, to not just alienate ourselves as clinicians and constructing clients as some other, that I am both and more than. And shame has been such a troubling entity in my own life that I had to study it. And my therapy training and my therapy failed to really reckon with it deeply, particularly as a gay man. But not only that, there was class and Irish Catholicism and all kinds of ingredients in there. So I had to go and study, and to go to the hedge school, as we did in Ireland under the occupation, is find other places of study. And I really had to reckon with shame deeply. And it's the most painful work and the most liberating work. And the most returning of, you know, my soul to its natural state, whatever that might be. So it's been the most potent work that I've done in groups, whether it was with young gay men back in the 80s when I was doing gay youth work, or more recently doing shame workshops. and really speaking to the nuance of shame around sexuality and gender and trans and all the ways the diverse manifestation of our embodiments. How do we speak to shame in nuanced ways, but also recognizing the commonality? That was really important in this piece. And I guess the last thing, I write to try and understand myself first and foremost. But I is we, so it's about us as much as it can be. And your enthusiasm about therapy, Uli, was really interesting. That rarely do I sit around and listen to people talking about their good experience of therapy, and I think that'd be a really next interesting exercise. A bunch of queer people writing about the experience of therapy. That would be an interesting project. I thank you, Chance, for the invitation, because it's very moving, to sit here virtually and feel the work of these unique chapters and this collection and what it's done already and what it will go on to do.
Yeah, it's true. It's really very powerful. And the experience of therapy is something actually I did a bit of research on, which I can maybe talk about later. But now I will read a bit from my introduction. So here we go. In spring 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic and national lockdown started to change lives as we'd lived them. Workplaces and meeting spaces emptied like caves. Days and weeks slowed down. Roads cleared of traffic, birthed quiet and birdsong. Space opened up for a collaborative psychotherapeutic cross-fertilization. Following a conversation with Dr. Gail Lewis, in which she notes some of the ways that Black lesbian poet and author Audre Lorde's ideas seem to echo the work of white heterosexual male psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion, I reread Lorde's essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury, and was struck by the therapeutic message in her description of poetry. Reflecting on the form as a revelatory distillation of experience that makes it possible to give name to the nameless so it can be thought, Lorde's words sound not dissimilar to what white psychoanalyst Christopher Bollas conceived with his unthought known, or the exploration of what we unconsciously learn of the object world as infants and how we can harness it in the service of our psyches. It wasn't the first time I had felt Lorde's words convey something vitally important about how we can examine and regulate our emotions. So it's not only poetry that is a vital place for self-reflection and understanding, as I believe therapy can also be, but also decolonial Black, lesbian, feminist, queer and trans perspectives that can bring richness to our profession, a richness that often goes unacknowledged or is even rejected as too political, as if the therapy encounter is a politics-free space. It is because of the politics inherent in our lives, the inequalities that are endemic to it, that therapy, however, can often be a luxury and also a privilege, especially for those in the LGBTIQA+ and the QTPOC communities. Therapeutic outcomes for these client groups also vary because sometimes of this unwillingness to accept that all of our identities are politicized under white cis heteropatriarchy. Indeed, Crawford found that in some research found that people from sexual and ethnic minorities are more likely to report experiencing lasting bad effects from therapy. Rhimes et al. Also found that compared to heterosexual women, lesbian and bisexual women had higher final session severity for depression, anxiety and functional impairment, and increased risk of not attaining reliable recovery in depression, anxiety or functioning. Similar results were found among bisexual men. In research by Stonewall, 1 in 20 LGBT people and 1 in 5 trans people reported they had been pressured to access services to change or suppress their sexual orientation and or gender identity. Therapists already have an ethical obligation not to practice so-called conversion therapy, but these harmful practices do take place. Further, as this book goes to press, many therapists are expressing their opposition to the government decision to exclude trans people from the ban on so-called conversion therapy practices, despite the fact that more recent statistics indicate that trans people are twice as likely as cisgender LGBT people to be offered or subjected to conversion practices. Anecdotally, I've heard from QTPOC individuals in therapy that it can be as much of a lottery to find therapists who are able to work with embodied racialized trauma, given its neglect in training institutions, alongside the lack of rigorous work around whiteness. The same can be said for finding therapists who have been well prepared for working with gender and sexuality diversity. And as Amanda Middleton notes, there are no guarantees about cultural competency regarding these intersectional markers. Both Sabat Chowdhury and Robert Downes observe that there simply isn't enough thought given to marginalised identities in most therapy trainings. The research on therapy outcomes made me think again about the relative paucity of therapeutic literature available to those who work with clients from LGBTIQA+ communities, and about who creates this literature and how knowledge is generated. This book aims to contribute something towards filling the gap of knowledge that exists in text form. And we could do with several more volumes still. So that's just the beginning of my introduction to the book. And I wanted, as my next and final piece of reading, to share with you from my, I've got 2 more chapters in the book, and one of them is about, is called Lesbian Erasure, from Freud's Lesbian Patient to the Present. I wanted to read from my chapter on lesbian erasure, which starts with reflections on Freud's paper that he wrote in 1920 on a teenage lesbian patient, so just over 100 years ago. And so I've included some critical lesbian readings of it and critique of his patriarchal, white, cis, het, Oedipal theory. And then it takes us through my personal family connection to Freud's lesbian patient. My grandma was the first woman she had sex with. And the thread all the way through is the way that the culture raises and diminishes lesbian identities. Now, the concept of lesbian erasure isn't new, but it's been weaponized against trans people recently. So naturally, I felt compelled to examine it because as a now trans-identified person with a significant lesbian lived experience, the accusation that I've heard from some that I've erased my lesbian past feels untrue. How could I? I feel fiercely protective and proud of my lesbian past. And secondly, I'm still read as a lesbian when I walk down the street. I mean, however I might choose to identify, and whether I'm with my female partner or not, just given how I look. And in fact, it's my transness that's erased by people, every day, who call me madam or lady or fucking dyke, depending on where I am. So I wonder, who is it that's doing the erasing and who's being erased? It feels like a divisive strategy or narrative that doesn't benefit anyone apart from patriarchy. Anyway, so I want to just read a bit about this from my chapter. So just before the bit I'm going to read, I cite a couple of lesbian psychoanalysts who I really like, who have written about how to queer the psychoanalytic theory around sex, gender, and bodies. So the first one, Harris, asserts that if psychoanalysis is to be fit for purpose, a theory is needed that recognizes the social power of categories like gender and sexuality in both conscious and unconscious experience, but that can also account for the way in which these categories at certain moments lose salience and become more porous. And then there's Decol, who imagines a theory of sexuality devoid of gender and sex that is based on feelings, erotic and otherwise, feelings that are sustained and transformed in our ongoing relationships throughout our lives. So in both of these assertions, there's a sense of fluidity. We must also move beyond pitting trans against lesbian and gay subjectivities, as some are, both in and outside of our profession, in the belief that lesbians are being lost to trans masculinities and that trans-inclusive therapy is lesbophobic. I'd like to explore this subject, which causes great pain to those on either side, and consider what is being lost and to whom, and what is being gained. It is posited that rising numbers of people who have identified as lesbian, regardless of age, are choosing to trade queer womanhood for non-binary and or trans masc identities. This story of alleged lesbian erasure emerged in the 1990s, in the UK and the US, as there seemed to be an increase in people who had formerly identified as lesbian choosing to have chest surgery and or take testosterone and articulate trans masculine identities. But this version of the story is told through a cis and homonormative lens. In my client work, I sometimes suggest to trans and or queer clients that we consider the issue that is causing trouble by looking at it through a trans or a queer lens, rather than a cis heteronormative one. When we see it from that perspective, as Amanda Middleton suggests, how might the problem change? Or is our way of seeing it through internalizing the dominant ideologies part of what is troubling us? So if we roll the lens to the trans and queer window to view this alleged occurrence of lesbian erasure, the story might be seen differently. Different in the sense that the label imposed on us by a system that categorizes people according to binary gendered metrics no longer fits for some. Further, the expansion of both gender expression within the categories of woman, man, and gender identity categories that exist beyond the binary is a positive and joyous thing that makes possible lives lived in a greater self-alignment, where everyone feels themselves to be on the gender continuum. For context, when many of us came out as lesbian, we faced disbelief and derision. Our sexual difference from the norm was experienced as dangerous by the heterosexuals who diminished us, perhaps because it opened the door to a wider sexual landscape that they'd not yet explored within themselves. If the person they'd hitherto known to be straight pronounced themselves lesbian, what impact might it have on them if they too were not wholly comfortable in their assigned label? Could this fear of and objection to the emergence of more trans and gender expansive folks that Harris, Benjamin, and Young describe in the book as the projection of unprocessed, disowned feelings onto trans people be a repetition of this trope? Furthermore, the concern about lesbian loss is not evidenced in the statistics. As this book went to press, a report found that the number of women aged 16 to 24 who identify as lesbian had risen from 3.1% in 2014 to 11.4%. This figure represents the highest number of lesbian identified women since records began. Research by the Office of National Statistics in 2020 found that the proportion of the UK population aged 16 and over identifying as lesbian, gay, or bisexual increased from 1.6% in 2014 to 2.2% in 2018. In the same year, a UK government study on gender and sexuality found that out of 108,000 respondents, 61% identified as gay or lesbian, 26% identified as bisexual, 7% identified as non-binary, 3% were trans women, and 3% were trans men. We get a rough picture of the populations here, and drilling down further, the statistics also reveal that trans respondents were much less likely to identify as gay or lesbian than cisgender respondents, but more likely to identify as bisexual or pansexual, with 5% identifying as queer. There's no record of the number of trans women who do identify as lesbian. We can see this as lesbian erasure too. And concern about losing lesbians to trans masculinity doesn't seem to be mirrored amongst gay males, who could be said to have lost some of their number to trans feminine identities. Could this be because those who mourn this so-called lesbian loss see gender affirmation in the direction away from female masculinity and towards trans masculinity as reinforcing the patriarchal elevation of the masculine, or even as the burying or rendering ghost-like of a former lesbian identity? I use the word direction in the Armedian sense of orientation because I believe that gender and sexuality are imbued with movement rather than fixedness. My own personal experience and those of some clients over the years tells me that for many of us, we will use the limited terms and frameworks available to us until something that fits better comes along. So I think I'll leave it there. I don't know if that kind of provokes any responses in either of you, Ellis and Robert.
There's so much to think about. Yeah, so many responses. I was just writing some notes about the idea of the numbers, how the numbers are not necessarily stacking up. This idea that lesbians are being erased, but actually there are more queer people, more trans people, more people moving away from the heteronormative sort of boxes. And I'll speak a bit about my chapter in terms of race and coloniality and gender. But what I was thinking about was, not necessarily not focusing on there being more people who identify in a certain way, but there's something for me around the undoing of cisnormativity, the undoing of heteronormativity, and how that goes back to what I think of as kind of a well, I suppose we're talking about pre-coloniality or pre-white supremacy, the very strict, rigid boxes that we've got today. So in one sense, we're kind of undoing things and going backwards to maybe a point or a sense of ourselves as humans as more expansive, but also something that came up in the event that we did last Friday, this idea of living in the future as well, that we're there's something about queerness that spans time for me, the way I think about it. We're both in the future and we're both before these colonial ideas of gender and sexuality. So there's something really exciting about those numbers, that there is a movement, that something is happening at this point in time, that we can gather data on, whatever that means. We're still finding boxes to put ourselves into to get that data, but I think that it seems to me there is something happening, something important happening in terms of undoing those that kind of rigidity. And I wonder how those people will identify again in 10 years time, 20 years time. Will they be using different words for themselves in the future? Again, not focusing on a fixed point. So it's interesting, the kind of the growth of the movement. How about for you, Robert? Did you want to jump in?
I'm aware of the polarization that's around right now, and partly what you're writing into, Chance, is nuanced understanding. And I guess how bereft I feel about the lack of that in the collective dialogue. There's polarization and discursive violence and physical violence, and how much we need town hall to really listen to one another, think with one another, and get into the complex nuance of who and what we are, so that some of these identities can also relax. That I don't go around every day thinking of myself as a gay man. Mostly we know our identities through the interface of hostility, not through the interface of a kind of fluid being ourselves and all the glory of it. That these identities come primarily to act as some kind of refuge that we don't get to relax in very often, because we're at odds with the world that's othering us. So listening to your piece, I was reminded of how much we need space, and how the dominant hegemony doesn't want us to think together, doesn't want us to really come to know and appreciate and comprehend one another, because that undoes too much. It threatens the system too much. So I'm kind of mindful of the need for that. And we're not really on Twitter.
That reminds me of the Wilfred Bion, and the attacks on linking and thinking, and that he identified, that Gail talks about in the book. How things are kept invisible in order to perpetuate dominant structures and ideologies. He was kind of really onto something. Anyway, Ellis, do you want to talk about read from your chapter and talk about yours?
Yeah.
Well, just invite everybody to take a breath, because this is a lot to sit with. We don't get to do this very often. So just everyone take a breath to...
Good idea.
A little bit of room for digestion of Chance's piece, and in preparation for Ellis's piece, to make some room.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Robert, actually, because what you were saying about thinking together, I thought, well, what about feeling together also? Right, being together and being in connection. I think we're encouraged to think together. We're okay up here. Let's have these academic papers. Let's intellectualize queer experiences. But as we said last week, again, we had an event last Friday, bringing together lots of the contributors, and what was said was wonderful, but actually the experience of being together in a space was incredibly powerful, I think, for everybody there. So there's I appreciate your invitation to breathe and to feel into what we're talking about, because it's big stuff. So yeah, I'll read a little bit from my chapter. It feels like in school where you've been asked to read from a book and you just worry you're going to miss every word and get it wrong. So my first point that I came to, I suppose, when I was thinking about this chapter was being wary about the idea of the authentic self when working alongside trans people. Authenticity, or expressing the authentic or true self, is assumed to be both an aim of transition and a goal of therapy. However, it takes on a very different valence when we think about trans lives and identities. I think the ideal of reaching the authentic self is damaging to the trans community, and as therapists, we need to interrogate that notion when we're supporting trans people. There's an expectation that trans folks are always trying to get to a core version of who they are. When they get to live it out, they live happily ever after. This is a huge amount of pressure. Who can truly say what their authentic self is? And if you can, how can you prove it to people who are demanding of proof? Which folks generally are when we think about trans experiences. I believe there's expression that feels easier, more peaceful, and more aligned with other parts of self. Expression that is constantly constructed, not something pure and final. For that reason, we can instead think about authentic selves, authentic expressions, instead of an aim of finding and living an authentic self. Trans folks in therapy can hold a huge amount of distress around the question of who they truly are, truly in captions. I can often visibly see the tension drain from clients' faces when we begin to expand our curiosity away from the binary of are you or aren't you trans? The idea of the authentic self also gives very little space to fluidity and our constantly changing versions of ourselves. The goal of reaching a true self can be a painful expectation for gender fluid people, for example. And it can be even more difficult for people to accept that fluidity if we are stuck focusing on a single ultimate destination. So when I approach my trans clients, I'm not thinking, what is your true self? I'm thinking about them exploring incrementally about what feels easier or better, more peaceful, more joyful, more aligned, or perhaps just less painful in this moment at this time, as opposed to thinking what is the core truth. Chance then comes in thinking about trans folks trying different names with different friends or partners or therapists, seeing how it feels for other people to use those names or pronouns perhaps. There's a demand within white cis heteropatriarchy for consistency, particularly regarding identity. And then I come in saying, yeah, the idea of consistency as a cis myth makes me think about the importance of categorization for white supremacy. We have to be able to categorize people, especially when thinking about race, sexuality, and gender. Interestingly enough, all things to do with the body, in order to create hierarchy, which can then justify dominance. Consistency is necessary for categorization. And categorization is necessary both for white cis heteropatriarchy and for the survival of the psi complex, which means the ways in which psychologists try to categorize the human condition. The DSM being a perfect example of that. Just jumping ahead a little bit, I would say the majority of people that I speak to, I've been working with almost exclusively trans clients for around 7 years, 7, 6, 7, 8 years, something like that. And I said that, there's a belief among cis therapists that people will come through the door and want you to help people decide if they're a man or a woman. In my experience, most of the distress I see with my clients is around them trying to figure out how to explore or express their gender without being disowned, attacked, expelled to the margins of society. Most of my work is preparation for hard conversations and an exploration of very legitimate fears about losing relationships, employment, medical care, and more broadly, safety. I think these are the things that take up more space for the majority of the trans clients that I see than actually the bigger question of what they want for themselves. The question often turns to fears about other people's reactions as opposed to whether transition is worth it. Other people's reactions and questions about whether transition is worth it as opposed to whether it holds meaning for them personally. And I just want to jump ahead a little bit again to think about my part on race. So acknowledging that we can't think about gender without thinking about race. So essentially, yeah, thinking a little bit about empire, about projects of colonization, and the classification of human beings from most developed to least developed, from full human to 3/5 human, 2/3 human. One thing that perturbed white European settlers seems to have been the ways in which different cultures around the world express gender and sexuality in a multitude of ways. White Europeans took this to be evidence of how they were savage, animalistic, uncouth. In order to maintain the illusion of superiority, diverse sexual and relationship practices, such as non-monogamy, were denigrated and continue to be to this day. And I recommend everybody to read Gender Trauma by Alex Ian Taffy. It's a really great, a wonderful book in which Alex talks about the settler colonial project, wiping out expansive expressions of gender and sexuality. So we then come to think about scientific racism around the same time, the idea that we can measure intelligence, we can measure how much of a human somebody is. And so I suppose, yeah, coming back to what we were talking about with your work, Chance, this idea of, something that I'm sitting with a lot at the moment is really trying to process the fact that these categories were created, that these categories are not they haven't arrived from the heavens, these categories. They were created purposefully in order to legitimize dominance, legitimize a certain way of being over another way of being, and to control politically, to control populations, to control bodies, control the way people express themselves sexually and in terms of their gender. And something that I'm very keen to think more on and with other folks is, perhaps normalizing trans experiences is one way to put it, but I think I feel very profoundly that trans people have always been here and queer people have always been here. And I talk about it, for myself, that I didn't believe there was anything wrong with me. I didn't believe, and I still don't believe there's anything inherently bizarre about my story or who I am, how I think about things. And it's not powerful enough just to think about gender or sexuality or race. Actually, I think what we need to do is think about coloniality and empire, and the fact that we're at the end of 500 years worth of very specific, very targeted work on behalf of white supremacy to create these boundaries between us. So before, when I was talking about, the before and the future, this is what I mean. We're acknowledging that even heterosexuality, the idea of heterosexuality, was created. The word didn't mean what it means now 100 years ago. And even the idea that sex is binary, that bodies are binary. I was really fascinated to learn recently that about 100 to 150 years ago, scientists were saying there's only one sex, there's only one body. There are different variations of the same sex, but 100 years ago, 150 years ago, if you talk to a scientist about sex, they would have said there's only one sex, it's just humans. There's a human sex, and the body has more or less heat or coolness to it, which is really, really fascinating to me, how even our idea of bodies, the reality of bodies that folks are very insistent on at this point, was also created. That's also new at this point. So I'll pause there anyway, but I really believe every time we talk in these ways, I'm thinking back to decoloniality, recreating, re-remembering, and being in the future also, what it means to undo white supremacy in terms of our bodies, our sexuality, and our practices, who we are in the world. Robert, do you want to, or does anybody want to jump in? And then we'll go next.
Potential essay there. I'm noting the grief, the ancestral grief of being captured in kind of rigid notion, racialized and gendered notions. I think there's a real grief to that that lives in us. And being so captured means we're in process. Whatever it will become, but we can't really know it, although we can imagine the future and be the future, as you point to. So I really appreciate that point. And I think the thing that really stood out for me is this, talking about authenticity. I rarely use the word because I think it's been so captured and misused as some kind of goal and lie. And I really like the nuance you bring to it in terms of transness, trans lives. So this whole, the need to disrupt this notion of authenticity. And I can imagine someone coming in the room, I want to be my authentic self. And I go, go on then. And what's the authentic truth right now? I'm shy, I'm scared, I've got my defenses on. That when we've got our structures on that are protecting us, they are authentic too. So I kind of really like the thinking you've got to do with what you wrote in that chapter.
Yeah, it's interesting. Right now in this moment, I'm not in touch with the grief, although I know there's grieving to be done. And I think I have done some grieving of my own in relation to the, not being able to embody myself in this version of myself for so long, and the sense of being I don't know, cis-washed. Is that a thing? But I'm kind of with the joy of it at the moment, actually, and the joy of, and the possibilities and the expansiveness, and I always felt like that. Even when I was identifying as cis, I always felt like transness was a liberation, and transness liberated everyone, and made possible all sorts of ways of being in terms of gender and bodies. And Juno Roche talks about gender and transness as a landscape, bodies as a landscape, and sort of moving away from just thinking about the body as a landscape. It just makes, for me, it just really sort of brings something alive, and makes me just think there's a blank canvas of possibilities, that can be painted in gradually, over the course of my life, or the course of any people's lives. I mean, there's so many things I'm grateful for about your chapter, Ellis, but it was mind-blowing for me to hear you say what you said. But I really loved also, and this is a quality that's in Robert's, and I'll shut up soon so that Robert can speak and read, but I really loved the quality of peacefulness and comfort that you talked about. Such simple things, and so so practical and so beautiful and so loving. What could you do in this moment that would make your life feel more comfortable, more peaceful. You know, such a beautiful invitation. And similarly, you know, Robert, when you talk in your chapter about shame, you know, reading through the chapter for me was like a kind of autonomic nervous system regulator. Literally by the end of the chapter, I just feel like just read this beautiful kind of embrace of you know, shame, you know, this loving embrace of shame. And it's such a you know, eye-opener, so refreshing and so beautiful and so compassionate. And it's very, very moving, your chapter. So why don't you talk about it?
I'll disrupt what you said a little bit to start with.
Okay.
Regulating the autonomic nervous system reduces us to our biology. I think it relaxes the soul. I really do.
Mm-hmm.
It relaxes our nature, what we really are, as well as having a physiological impact on the nervous system that we clearly need. But anyway, reading. Despite school being one of the most violent places I participated in, I did like reading out to the teacher, even though he was a sadistic bastard. But anyway, here we go. I'm going to read. Okay. So, locating shame primarily in the mother-baby dyad, I take to be problematically reductive, leaving mothers navigating a lot of shame about their parenting, rather than locating the issue within a system that is actually hostile to parenting and children, into a system that primarily seeks bodies that will shop and work and scroll while creating hierarchies of value and invisibility, marking out some embodiments as ideals and others as more disposable than others. Thus, I think it is essential to consider shame via a range of critical lenses. For all queer embodiments, this is a significant notion to return shame to the systems, to relieve ourselves and our clients of the tendency to blame ourselves for the harm that got into our queer selves. We often blame ourselves for poison going in, which is crazy and lovely at the same time. We really wanted to keep it out. We came here really just wanting to be ourselves, and we arrived to pre-existing trouble that inevitably gets in. My working definitions and descriptions of shame need to be rooted in this perspective because we internalize systemically created harmful narratives. We can sadly make them our own while they are born of dominant discourses. Thankfully, for many of us, something about our nature contends with this arrangement, with these arrangements that are innocently downloaded while we resist and insist otherwise. Ellis spoke to this about, I knew there wasn't something wrong with me whilst all this stuff is getting dumped in me. There's something that's before us that is untouchable. So to respond to your question, Chance, about how shame manifests in us and between us in the therapeutic dyad, I will say this for now, because there's plenty more to say. One of the challenges of working with shame is the shaming agents that operate in our psyches about the shame we experience. Part of the work is coming to terms with the multiplicity of our own minds and how agents of shame are internalized and will be triggered and enacted in the therapeutic relationship. So far in my experience, they don't go. I just become more able to respond creatively to their presence, including in my practice. I often think of the work of living with shame as an ongoing process of befriending ourselves and the array of voices and characters that reside in the realm of our psyche, including a befriending attitude towards the sometimes vicious occupants. Another way I think of that is living with some really dodgy flatmates in your own head. They're not going anywhere, so you've got to work out how to live with them. So shame work for all queer embodiments requires a comprehension of how heteronormative, white, racialized, gender binary, patriarchal culture conflictually resides in our psyches. And I think we often feel deep shame that we are both the enemy and the resistor. We are both the enemy and the one who's subjected to the persecution inside. It's really painful for us to, I worked with a young man recently. He was the most homophobic man I've ever met. And he's gay. The homophobia in him was the most violent I've ever met. But it gets in. How do you befriend that? So we might reckon with this as an ongoing practice in life and within therapeutic practice, and humor is essential. We need to be able to step in into the matrix of shame when it manifests. We tend to want to get away because it is always there in the background until something is disrupted in the contact that makes it more figural, brings it to life. The magic happens when we are open to it, and the reality that within each therapeutic relationship, we might co-create a crucible for working with shame. It helps to name shame directly and to share stories about particular aspects of shame so that we can feel and think about it together. I directly invite shame out of the closet that we usually attempt to keep it in. For some queer clients, I have offered readings that speak to something of their experience of shame so that it becomes something we can mutually explore with more symmetry. I'm not the only one with the knowledge. So the last bit. So Chance asks me something. I remember in your shame training, you talked about the antidote to shame as being able to give yourself to yourself as you are. Yes, that is the powerful bit, as you are, and living embodied radical acceptance that for me has taken time and a lot of gathering to be able to formulate experiences of shame into narratives. I remember when I used to just be drowning in shame. It's like drowning in battery acid. You can't think and you can't speak and you can't tell anyone. You're just burning and you don't want to exist. So to get to a place where I can be with those moments of fragmentation and meet them creatively has been quite a journey. I recall in my training that I tried to hide shame. No one had offered a teaching and an invitation to be with shame in as explicit a manner, in an explicit, I can't read my own sentences, that I and others needed. To give yourself to yourself as you are requires practice. Imagine that someone comes in the door. If you give yourself to yourself as you are right now, what's here? It's a lovely invitation.
Mm.
So I make the invitation. And repeat it regularly. Repeating the question invites a deepening into the unknown, as well as creating a self and other intimacy that can enable some relaxation of the self-care system. And there is a line from a Rilke poem that I use for myself in the shame workshops I have done. How I yearn to belong to something, to be contained in an all-embracing mind that sees me. And that sentence has been accompanied for many years, and it means different things at different points. And at some point I realized, oh, I've become the embracing mind that now sees me. And I think that's the potency of a kind of a blackening and a queering of the therapeutic project, is this nuanced, very embracing way of being with the toxins that got in and how we can alchemically alter them. Amen.
Amen.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. I mean, another thing that you said in the chapter was that shame needs to be in the company of bodies that can receive it. And I think that for many of us, when we grew up, I guess we didn't have bodies around us that could receive it. And so it sort of, where did it go? It just sort of somehow sedimented within us and sat around and did its damage. So offering that, in a therapeutic context is such a beautiful thing, you know, to be able to offer and receive.
Sometimes all it requires is a simple thing. I think you're in shame right now. What do you reckon?
I loved the moment in your chapter where you talked about being at the Gestalt training and the touching of fingers. I don't know if you want to tell people what that was about, but I was really moved by the imagery of just connection, because, you know, from what I've read about shame, I've understood that, you know, the antidote to it is connection. It's about being back in connection. And as you were talking about that, I was thinking about, you know, of course, being in connection with others being perhaps the most potent form of antidote, but also being in connection with other parts of ourselves. So having other parts of our internal landscape that can say, okay, you're in shame right now, we can hold that, and that's not actually yours and it belongs somewhere else. And then perhaps another part who's angry on our behalf, and another part who's the protector, another part who is grieving the shame. It just really made me think about moving away from authenticity and individualism, the one true truth, you are a very ashamed person, to that in sort of almost like an internal community of parts, you know. And that is, again, not to bring everything back to coloniality, but there's some parallel there for me about moving away from individualism, moving away from strict boxes, binaries, to fluidity, movement with others outside of ourselves and inside of ourselves as well. So there's something there for me about how I can almost feel the tension dissipate when we talk about that connection. Yeah, made me think. Loads to think about. I was really, really moved by a chapter as well, Robert. I would say. Really moved by it.
I read it beforehand and I was moved again too. and I was reading yours as well, both, and I've read them a few times now, and different movements come, different nuances come, so it makes it living. Yeah. And the thing about the finger is that in shame we take ourselves to be so hated, we can't imagine that someone would move towards us. And what I loved about this Gestaltist is she microdosed contact. She really microdosed it to see because inside shame there is still the one who wants to reach. Otherwise we would die, we would disappear. Someone wants to be here. There's a rage about the other shaming us as well. So that she knew there's a little reach in there somewhere, and she knew to not be too much. Yeah.
Love that bit.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I'm just wondering if there's anybody who wants to ask anything at this point, or even talk. There was an invitation to talk about your experience of therapy.
And just
do that.
Either questions or comments, responses.
Yeah. Feelings.
There's no tyranny about having to be clever or anything.
Yeah, whatever. There's a question here. How can we as therapists support clients who are considering transitioning?
Well, what question?
Maria?
Big question.
What do I say in the book? I think, people want the practical answers, and there are some practical considerations. So making sure you have the correct language, making sure that even though the language kind of moves and changes and is different, people will use it differently. So there's no kind of stock glossary of words that are always going to be true. But doing a little bit of homework about the language that people might be using. I think acknowledging the very specific experience of trans folks at this point in time in this country, so being aware of the political landscape that we're dealing with, the disaster around lack of access to medical support, for example. I think all these things give you a little bit of context, which I think is important. What do I say? I'm not trying to flog the book, but I would recommend having a look at the book, actually, because there's quite a lot about it in my chapter. But another thing I think about quite a lot is moving away from the binary. Are you or aren't you trans? And I don't know, Maria, if you wanted to say any more, if there's anything specific you wanted to ask. I don't know if Maria's even still here. I can't see everybody, but
can I just respond to that as well? Because I think often we think we've got to become expert in some other rather than remain curious therapists. And for me, I'd be like, what does that mean, and what does that look like for you in this moment? So it'd be really phenomenologically to study, as you pointed to, Ellis, but to also be phenomenologically kind of present to it, not coming to any conclusion internally, or knowing or I need to know what they mean by this. I need to understand what this means to you right now.
I suppose sorry, Robert,
Go on, no, carry on.
Just coming from that, probably the best thing to do is ask the client.
Yeah.
What support do you need from me at this point?
Yeah.
I mentioned in the book, when I came out, only one person was excited for me. One person said, "Oh my God, that's amazing. Congratulations. What name do you want me to use? What pronouns do you want me to use?" There's one person who did that. Everybody else was, almost literally every single other person was quite tense, quite shocked, wasn't sure how to respond. Even if they weren't sort of hostile, I won't forget that one person, it naturally felt celebratory for me. So essentially, I suppose that's to say, different clients might want different things. Not everybody will want you to collude with the idea that there's going to be tension and hostility around it. That is a collusion with what the rest of the world is saying. That client might just feel really relieved and really joyful. They might feel very scared. They might be confused. There's probably lots of feelings that can come up. So back to the point, sit with the clients, figure out where they're at, what they need, because there isn't one thing that will fit.
Yeah, and I suppose I would add, if you're a cis therapist, then just try and read, trans writing, or listen to trans people talking about transness, because there is a different way of looking at gender and bodies. And I've heard from a lot of trans clients who have been working with cis therapists who have asked questions that come from a very cis place. It's difficult to sort of like explain exactly what that is, but they're just questions that have made them feel like the therapist doesn't get them or understand them, or has problematized their transness or transition or surgeries or whatever. So I think sort of accustoming yourself and acclimatizing yourself to trans thinking and ideas, and of course there isn't one mono thing, is really important to do some research, buy the book. I am going to do a blatant plug.
I would add to that as well, do training if you can, get some decent training under your belt about gender and sexuality and all that stuff, but also I would say do some work for yourself in interrogating your position, your cisness, your gender. I can't see you, Maria. I don't know anything about you, but I don't know how much work you might have done on understanding your own gender, but that's often the part that's missing. There's an assumption that trans people have genders and everybody else is normal, but actually everybody has a gender, everybody has a relationship to sexuality, everybody has a relationship style. So yeah, take some time to perhaps discover yourself, think through these things for yourself, and see what happens.
And I would suggest I don't even have a gender, that it's more matrix than that. Because some people might view me as a man, some people will view me as less than a man, some will view me as near a woman, that it's this complexity, that it was not self-authored. It's completely constellated out of negation or affirmation of a particular version of masculinity and negations of femininity. And that is always an alive, changing thing. There isn't a secure gender in me. There cannot be, because I'm a gay man. Because it's completely constructed within this white heteropatriarchy. I remember reading Judith Butler's chapter on gender construction and crying for a whole weekend, because there was such a grief about the construction of gender, raced gender, being such a negation of the human soul and rigidifying of the human soul, that in this lifetime, I won't know what we can be. I get a flavor of it. The freedom beyond these constrictions. So I wanted to add that note to our kaleidoscope.
Sounds like gender 102 rather than the 101, right? But yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I'm really, I think sometimes on maybe too big of a scale, but I'm thinking about undoing all these traumas, these boxes, as being it's a project that's going to outlive us. It's been taken 500 years very specifically to get to this point. May take another 500 to get to some other point, but we're doing part of this work, right? It's a part of the wave of undoing, I think.
Well, you're beginning to answer another question that's come up. You might want to carry on. What did you discover about yourself or your practice in contributing to this book?
I have lots to say. I have a lot to say. That's really nice to, for someone who I've never enjoyed public speaking. I was very, very painfully shy entire life, really. That actually, I have a lot to say at this point. And that's really lovely to know, for me to know about myself. I'm enjoying it.
What did you discover, Robert?
What did I discover? That I'm an elder.
That's a privilege, isn't it?
Yeah. That I had something to say, that I'd learned. My gay youth group work really came back to me. I didn't know I was doing de-shaming, decommissioning shame there, but that's a lot of what I did. We vote to love. I was doing gay youth work when I was in my early 20s. I should have been in the group, but anyway, I was precocious. And I was already in therapy, so I introduced some of that flavor. So we vote love in the face of shame. So I was glad to see my learning and gathering of that. And this being altered, this continual project of being remade by the encounters, being with you both, working together, being more intimately connected in dialogue with trans people more than I have been before. So really being remade.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I learned how much I had more to learn in talking to everyone. As a queer person who's been, lesbian and queer identified for, about 30 years, you know, and lived and worked, you know, as a professional lesbian for many years as the editor of Diva magazine, you know, and being at the center of, you know, culture and stuff in many respects. I was just, yeah, I just thought I knew quite a lot, but evidently not enough. And we never know enough, do we? And it was just such a joy and such a, yeah, it was just such a joy to be able to learn more and more and more and expand, and just to know, to really, really know how there's always so much more to learn. And yeah, I think that's it. I think somebody's asking, how do you find a trans therapist? And then we maybe might have to go. I don't know. And we sort of aimed to finish at 8:15, didn't we? Early, and it's 8:20 nearly. But finding a trans positive therapist. Well, the Pink Therapy directory is a good place to look. And yeah, I think you'd probably find somebody there.
Also the Gendered Intelligence directory. So Gendered Intelligence run like a 2-day, it's a weekend training for therapists and counselors. And yeah, everybody who's been on that training is allowed to be on the directory. So everybody who's on there has done like 2 days, quite you know, relatively intensive learning on the subject. So recommend that. It's on their website, Gendered Intelligence website. And also the QTPOC therapist directory. If you have a Google of that, the Black Trans Foundation created a directory of the folks who've worked with them. And I'm on the list as well, Black Trans Foundation. It's called the QTPOC therapist directory. You should be able to find it.
G has said, I'm interested in queer history and mad history, but don't see much written about both. Do you have anything I can read, please? Yes. This is a good book called Before We Were Trans, which is a great history book. And there's another one which I have here, which is, oh gosh. Oh yeah, this is really good too. Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity. So those are my two suggestions. I'm sure they're available at Gaze the Word.
Also, yeah, Gender Trauma is good. Alex Ian Taffy, Gender Trauma is quite, yeah, it gives a historical context to gender.
There's books, there's references in the book, in the chapters.
Yeah, there's lots of kind of references there at the back of the book, loads of references. So yeah. So
there's one more question, I think. Do you have experiences? Can you see that one? Do you have experiences with supportive colleagues in the mental health sector who are non-LGBTQ?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And if you find them, they exist. And
Chance, are you about happy to wind up there? Is this a good endpoint for you guys?
Yeah, and if Jamie wants to write,
how about you?
I think it's fine. And if Jamie wants to write to one of us about the training question, feel free to do so.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I guess I just need to say thank you to all of you, really. That it almost felt kind of, it was incredibly intimate, it was moving, it felt very special, it almost felt spiritual at points. So I just want to say thank you so much for sharing and for contributing to such a a powerful and potentially kind of redefining book. Thank you to all of you. There is a discount code on the book through the Gaze and Words website. If you enter the code word talk in your cart page, you're going to get £5 off the book. But I just want to leave the final words to Chance, Ellis and Robert to say goodbye and thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for everyone for coming, and it's such a shame we can't be in the room together. I can't, we can't hear you and see you and smell you and hold you, but it's lovely to just to be here virtually with you, and to share in the ideas and the thinking and the feelings. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the book, and thank you to Ellis and Robert again, and Uli.
All right, have a lovely evening, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Thank you so much.